It's wonderful today to welcome as our guest Warren Mosler. For most of you, probably almost all of you, Warren needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him a short introduction. Anyway, Warren is the widely respected economist, finance professional, and entrepreneur who, a little bit more than 30 years ago, um, independently developed a set of ideas which eventually became known as modern monetary theory. He's the author of Soft Currency Economics, which was a paper that he produced in the mid-90s, and a book, The Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, and the MMT white paper, both of which you can access on the MoslerEconomics.com website. And without Warren, there'd be no modern monetary theory, obviously. And so there'd be no Torrens University Masters degree featuring modern monetary theory. So many of you here are doing a master's degree which would not exist were it not for Warren. And what I wanted to do was to hear Warren talk about the background and the basics of MMT, really, so that you can learn what modern monetary theory is from the originator. So maybe I can start by saying thanks very much for joining us, Warren. And where did these ideas come from? Did you get a flash of inspiration 30 years ago, or did it take years for you to develop what became MMT?
That's an interesting question. So I had to be thinking about something to be thinking about it. And so, and somebody had reminded me of something in maybe 1977. I was at Bankers Trust. I was on the trading desk there, and I was a new guy, young guy there.
So I got Thursday night, and then the briefing Wednesday.
Can you mute everybody, Gabby?
Yeah. So there's other talk on the line. Is that just me, or is it?
Yes.
Okay, it's good now.
Yeah. Sorry, folks. Can you please mute?
I did.
Can everyone please mute?
Color bar. I want to put this light on this mobile.
Okay, we good. So, and I was on the trading desk, and Alan Rogers was the trading manager, and he used to talk like this. He didn't move his mouth, and he goes, "It's $2 billion 2-year notes going to be auctioned." He says, "I don't know where the money's going to come from for those. They were afraid there might be a failed auction or something." And I remember saying to Alan, "It's the same money that the Treasury spends that's used to buy the securities. It's just debits and credits on the spreadsheet. It's circular." He kind of looked at me sideways, and then just went back on talking about whether or not there was going to be enough money out there to buy the bonds in the auction. So I don't know where I got that. I mean, nobody told me about that. And it was obvious enough at the time for me to just respond in this trading meeting. I'd been there maybe a year or less. Before that, I was at a small savings bank, and I had been, I was at Bayesian Company doing with small institutional accounts for a year. And then before that, a small savings bank had $5 million in their investment portfolio, and I was the person they selected to look at it. So I don't know where I got that kind of stuff. And I remember when maybe a year later, when the Fed increased reserve requirements, and Alan again is there with Alan Lerner, our economist. I hope the Fed doesn't just give them the money this time, because the money supply is too high. There's too much money sloshing around. The money supply is too high. They got to take it out. And I said, they have to give it to them, Alan. Where's it going to come from? It's a spreadsheet. There's debits and credits, assets and liabilities. They've increased the reserve requirement. It can only come from, they have to make the entry. And he goes, well, there's 300 billion euro dollars sloshing around. They can bring some of those home. I'm like, no, they can't. It's the same thing. And then I got a call from Cliff Viner, who later became my partner. He was at Phoenix Mutual. And he says, well, I was reading this article by Eric Heinemann, Morgan Stanley's chief economist, about, he doesn't think the Fed should just give them the money this time. They should take it out of the money supply, reduce the money supply. And I gave him the answer how they have to do it. And he's very analytical. So I showed him the debits and credits. So he calls Morgan Stanley, and then he calls me back with their double talk answer, and I straighten that out. And he calls him back, and then he calls me back second time, and he says they've retracted their analysis. Okay, they agree that the Fed has to give them the money, and so that was a senior economist at Morgan Stanley. I was a very junior person just talking to a client, and now where I got that and that definitively, I'm really not sure. I don't remember discussing it with anybody. I certainly remember asking questions about, Fed funds, what happens over the Fed debits our account, credits their account, things like that. So I looked at the operations. They're not that difficult, right? And so, and then every morning they used to come down and go, oh, they went to check to see how many bonds the Bank of England bought, because if the Bank of England ever didn't buy our debt, the U.S. might default or rates would go up or something horrible would happen. It's like, I was like, why do you guys care about this? They said they don't go to them. It's the second highest bidder. It's the same money the Treasury is spending anyway. It doesn't really matter who buys it. But it was a big deal. And then after that, it was the Saudis and the Japanese and the Chinese. What if they don't buy the debt? And I've just been hearing this stuff for 50 years. So
I remember you discussing, I think it's in the Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds book.
Yeah.
Italian government.
Yeah. Same thing. Italian bonds were 200 basis points, 2% higher in yield than the cost of borrowing the lira. So you could borrow lira at 10% and buy lira bonds at 12%. You'd guaranteed a 2% profit if they didn't default. And the reason the spread was there is because it was universally thought that they were going to default. And Rudy Dornbush was a big-time economist back then from MIT, and he'd been going around talking about how Italy, with their debt to GDP of 120%, was on the edge of default, and they weren't going to be able to buy their debt. And the spreads widened out. And so I was looking at it. I had never had any reason to think of why Italy would default or not default before that. I think if I had a reason to look at it, I would have come up with it sooner, but I just didn't have any reason until then. That was probably 1993 and late 92 to late 93. And it dawned on me I was just chatting about it, because if you could figure out why they went default, it was a good investment for all my investors in the fund. And so I went to like S&P and Moody's and asked them, had there ever been any defaults in local currency? And they said, yes, there's been 7 or 8. And when I looked at them, they were things like Brazil defaulted. The inflation was so high that the value of the bonds was trivial. What would have been 1 billion pesos was worth 2 cents or something. So nobody ever bothered to redeem them, or they just let it go. And so Moody's called that a default. And they said the United States defaulted when it went off the gold standard. Well, okay, that wasn't floating exchange rate. They agreed. And Japan defaulted. They told me Japan defaulted to the United States in yen in 1943. Okay, well, that was it's not because they didn't have the ability to make the payment. They just didn't, there was a war going on. They weren't going to pay us any money. So there were no material instances of anyone ever defaulting. And the reason they were saying is because they can print the money. But in none of the instances, never has any government facing all these high debt levels ever printed the money to pay it off, whatever that means. That never happened. So it had to be something else. And that's when I was talking to my research guy about what I'd heard. And it dawned on me that if we bought Treasury securities from the Treasury securities, it didn't matter to us whether we bought them from the Fed or from the Treasury, because I would own the same thing, which was, deposited at the Fed under the name of the Treasury. And my, dollars would get transferred from Bank of New York to the Fed for same place. So there was absolutely no functional difference to us in the private sector, whether the Treasury sold bonds or the Fed sold bonds. So if there wasn't any for us, and there can't be any, was my conclusion, my thinking, probably isn't any. And so the whole thing is either a big borrowing operation, or it's just, interest rate support, which is why the Fed would buy and sell securities to meet their interest rate targets. And then it immediately dawned on me, okay, this is just all one big glorified reserve drain. It's just securities are sold to support the policy rate at the time. They didn't pay interest on reserves. And so you have to have an alternative to non-interest bearing reserve accounts. And the alternative was Treasury securities, which were just time deposits at the Fed. And so that was kind of the answer to that question. All right. And so at that point, I realized that's the reason they don't default. Actually, they're spending first, crediting accounts, and then debiting accounts for either tax payment or to facilitate the bond purchases.
And that's a really vital insight, isn't it?
I knew the rhetoric inside the Fed. Look, why would they come in and do repo, when payments were due from the private sector to the Treasury? Because the funds aren't there. They have to add the funds. And the way they'd say it is, we can't do a reserve drain without a prior reserve add, which is the same thing. And so all those pieces just came together because that's what, they're all floating around in our heads anyway. And it all just gelled for this particular purpose, which was to determine, to take a look at default in local currency and what it actually is. And at that point, it was, okay, now it's safe to buy these Italian bonds, but it isn't. For the same reason Japan didn't make payments. Just because they have the ability to pay doesn't mean they'll do it. They can still, we can hit a debt ceiling and we don't pay, even though we have the ability to pay. So the idea was to go to Italy and talk to the people at Treasury so that they would understand it, so that they would realize it makes no sense to not pay. Everything's better if you do pay. There's no advantage whatsoever to not going the other way, and it's automatic. There's no, risk of anything or anything like that. So one of my clients was Maurice Samuels, more of an associate than a client. He was at Harvard Management, managing their endowment fund for fixed income, and it was much larger than my company. And he had the Harvard Management on his business card, so he had his secretary, whatever, contact the people at the Italian Treasury to set up a meeting. They said, "Sure, come on over." Maurice Samuels from Harvard Management. And so we went over there and talked to a guy named Luigi Spaventa. And he was a professor who had been taking a stint at Treasury. And he was either Treasury Secretary or Assistant Treasury Secretary. And we go into his office, and it was very gloomy there. They were all worried about default. On his desk was a document 2 inches thick from Rudy Dornbush about why Italy was going to default. And I said, and he looked like he was like Keynes. He was Italian. He spoke British. I spoke English with a perfect British accent. He had like a pipe and 3-piece suit, and looked like he was, trying to impersonate Keynes. I said, "Professor Spaventa, it's a rhetorical question. Don't answer it. But why is Italy selling these securities, BTPs, CCTs? Is it to get the lira to spend, or is it because if you spend the lira and then don't issue the securities, the interbank rate, will fall from your target rate of 10% to 0. And he looks at me and he says, and he thinks about it for a minute, and he goes, "No, the interbank rate will only fall to 0.5% because we pay a support rate. They paid interest on reserves." I didn't know that at the time. I said, "Okay." And before I could say anything, he had figured the rest of it out. And he jumps up out of his seat and he goes, "Yes, and they're making us act pro-cyclical." And he goes into this rage against the IMF for trying to impose austerity on them. And it went from doom and gloom to like this celebration. And he starts inviting people in from the next offices over. And they come in and he explains it, and everybody's smiling now. They had this huge cappuccino machine. They're making us cappuccino, and Maurice and I had to sneak out to our next meeting. We couldn't stay there. We were there for like 2 hours. We finally snuck out to our next meeting. And then a week later, announcements came out of Treasury. No extraordinary measures will be taken. All payments will be met. And that's when we felt comfortable owning the Italian bonds, and we did for ourselves and our clients. And it's a very successful investment for our investors. And that started me looking at the U.S., because now here we have Ross Perot talking about default and the Treasury and the debt, and he's taking 15% of the vote and changing the complete political dynamics on this total nonsense. And that's when I wrote Soft Currency Economics, was 1993, to address that political situation, to show that that's just a reserve drain. residual. It's the net financial assets in the economy. It's just you pay it off by shifting dollars from securities accounts to reserve accounts. There's no grandchildren or taxpayers in a row. The whole thing. So, did I answer your question?
You did, yeah. I mean, make it really, really simple. Before people can pay taxes, but also before anybody can buy treasury securities in the primary market, the government has to spend the dollars into, or the local currency units into existence, or the central bank has to lend into existence.
Right. So the central bank is a bank. It's just a T account like any other bank. It's no different, except its clients are just other banks and foreign central banks, and they have accounts on its books, and it can only debit and credit accounts on its own books. And so you can't, if you have an account there, you can't have it credited unless the Fed credits your account, and then you can't transfer that credit unless you have it. And so all the funds to be transferred to pay taxes or to buy bonds have to come from the Fed, which is an agent of Congress, right? And so, and they can only be transferred from one account to another. So it's actually very simple. It couldn't be simpler. And it's got nothing to do with funds in commercial banks or anything else in their own accounts. Each commercial bank has its own set of books, and only it can debit and credit accounts on its books. Any banks like that. And that's what bank clearing is all about. How do you get a deposit that's on one bank over to be a deposit on another bank when all they can do is change numbers on their own books? It sounds impossible, but you do it through a third bank clearing entity where they both have an account there. So at that third entity, they can switch funds from their account to the other guy's account. And anyway,
so why are treasury bonds issued in the first place? Prior to quantitative easing, it was obvious from an MMT perspective, it was to defend the target rate. But once you've got excess reserves in the system, why are we still issuing?
I think it's just something left over, maybe from a fixed exchange rate like the gold standard, where the credit to the reserve account was convertible into gold, or gold certificates were convertible into gold. So if the government spent simply by crediting accounts, they were at risk that whoever had those accounts could just on a whim say, I want my gold. Whereas if they bought a treasury security, then it's there for a year, 2 years, 5 years, and they can't ask for the gold for 5 years. So it's to put some distance between convertibility, of the, the money. And so, and that's where you get the whole idea of a hierarchy of money back then, was because you had distance, between the gold and whatever you were holding. So at the top maybe is the gold itself, and then it's a gold certificate, or it's a deposit at the central bank, which is convertible into gold. They'd be right up there in the hierarchy. Then after that, it might be treasury securities, because you have to wait for them to mature and something might happen. And then you'd have corporate debt or something where to get the gold, you have to get the money, then you have to cash it in. So, the whole thing about the different levels hierarchy was about distance from convertibility. And so once you go on a floating exchange rate, that's all inapplicable. Yet you still see these things about hierarchies of monies with floating exchange rates. I look at it, it doesn't seem like, it seems like somebody's trying to put a square peg in a round hole. They're trying to apply fixed exchange rate tool of analysis to a floating exchange rate.
So it's 52 years since the US finally went off the gold standard. Are we saying that most economists' understanding of the monetary system is more than 50 years out of date?
I'd say, there's a lot of gold standard type of fixed exchange rate assumptions in their models for sure. Intergenerational, whatever they call it, is that's a gold standard. That's a fixed exchange rate model. There are a lot of fixed exchange rate assumptions in their model, and of course, none of them have a source of the price level. In fixed exchange rates, they had it, which was the gold setting, which was a price setting by the government, right? That would be the price set exogenously by the government that they could then markets would express, relative value. Markets express relative value. They don't express absolute value. And so all the Fed's models, all the central bank models are all relative value models. They don't have any starting point. So what they do is they assume the starting point is yesterday's closing prices. Well, where did they come from? And they'll tell you, they'll tell you that, we'll start with yesterday's closing prices, then we'll tell you why they might change, expectations or something. And then, but where did those prices come from? Well, where did yesterday's prices come from? Well, they came from the prices the day before, plus or minus whatever made them change. So all they have is an infinite regression with no absolute, no way to determine the price level, the absolute value of the price level. And so you can take any one of these models, and they're just waiting for you to tell them whether it's dollars or yen or pennies or whatever you want to do, and then they'll show you all the prices. But they can't get that information. It's got to come exogenously, and that's true of all markets. And so they'll tell you that. I just read a while back that they've been working on this for 50 years and they haven't come up with one. And so what it is the price level is a function of prices paid by the government when it spends, and the government only has to spend on one thing, and then the markets can take that information and do their best, of course, to determine relative value, which gets filtered through all the other institutional structure as well. So the government says an ounce of gold is going to be $2,000 and we're going to fix it there. Now the markets can sort that out, figure out where other prices are. But if the government's not saying that, then where does the price level come from? Well, it's what it tells you have to do to get the funds to pay taxes when it spends. And it's not spending on gold at a fixed price. So you have to use, it's the rest of the spending it's doing is giving the market information about absolute value, which it then translates through market forces into all the relative values, which are all the other prices we see. But as a point of logic, there's no dispute about that. There's no other way.
That feeds back into tax liabilities, creating a demand for the currency in the first place.
Sure.
And what you say about the currency is a public monopoly. Right.
So what I do is start with what I call my base case for analysis, which is the money story. So you have to start somewhere and how it works and what it goes on. And the starting point is the tax liability, the tax requirement, rather than the payment of taxes. And that leads to issues which I find troublesome. People saying taxes don't fund spending, where tax liabilities clearly facilitate the whole thing. Now, the word fund is ambiguous. Does fund mean actually supply the actual pieces of paper or credits necessary? No, it doesn't do that, but it certainly facilitates the whole thing. And so, we use the different examples. The example of Africa, where the British wanted people to work on a plantation, grow coffee. And the whole point of the whole thing is always a taxing authority that's trying to provision itself. That's my starting point. You have a government that wants public health, it wants defense, it wants public education. How do you get people out of the private sector into the public sector? And you do that by creating a tax liability in something they don't have and that only you have. So I use the African example where the British put a tax liability on everybody's house, and they called it a hut tax. I think the French did the same thing. And if you don't pay your hut tax, the military is there, we're going to burn your house down. So it's coercive. Taxation has to be coercive. The Internal Revenue Service, the taxing authority, is the biggest, baddest agency in government, and they have incredible powers to do bad things to you if you don't pay your taxes. That's what's underpinning the whole system, whether anybody likes it or not. And so they put a tax liability on it. And what does that do? It creates a population that suddenly needs the dollars or the crown or whatever the tax liability specifies to pay their taxes. Otherwise, they're going to get their house burned down. All right. And so it creates people looking for paid work. Now, that's exactly how we define unemployment, people looking for paid work, not people looking to volunteer at the American Cancer Society, right? And you can't have people. And so the tax liability functions in the first instance to create unemployment, people looking for paid work, for the further purpose of the government to hire those people to provision the government, which is why it's undergoing this exercise in the first place. And so it's very simple. It's been done for thousands of years. You put some kind of a tax liability in place. And the simplest one to think about is the property tax. They used to use a head tax, where if you didn't pay, you got your head cut off. But if you start using a transaction tax, like an income tax, it gets a little blurry. It's still there, but it's a lot more complex, the analysis, because it's a moving target. And you have to have imputed taxes and all that. So I won't run off on that. But so we'll start with a simple, asset tax, a house tax, or a head tax. That creates unemployment. You then hire the people, and now you've provisioned yourself. You pay them, and then as the last step, they pay the tax. And so, yes, the government didn't need their tax money to spend. In fact, it had to spend first before they could pay the tax. And as people generally want to, the tax liability creates a need to pay taxes, but it also creates a savings desire because it instills enormous anxiety in the population. It's probably the source of most of the anxiety and all the medications people are on is this ongoing tax liability. It's brutal. All this greed for money and all these people that can never get enough. And we had a salesman who was 85 years old, and as he was being wheeled into the hospital about to die, he did one last trade on his phone from the gurney to make more money. This is what the tax liability does to the human mind, right? But it's very effective. It provisions the government and wins the wars for the government. And so here it is. And so we're okay, so anyway, so the whole sequence is an MMT contribution to get the sequence right. Every congressman has the sequence wrong. They think they have to get the money to be able to spend. And if they don't get it, they can't spend unless they borrow. If they can't borrow, they can't spend. And if they do borrow, they have to leave the debt to the grandchildren to pay it back. So they've got, when you have the sequence backwards, it goes all over the place. And that's why I was doing this, to try and sort out that sequence and get it right. And it comes down to, as you said, yep, go ahead.
They think that deficit spending pushes interest rates up.
Well, it can, sure. If you tell me if I'm in charge of the government and you want me to, I could do enough deficit spending to get prices as high as you want. No problem.
But they think that deficit spending drives interest rates up. And in your story, deficit spending more than you collect in taxes without draining the additional reserve system puts interest rates down, doesn't it?
Right, but let's look at the purpose of taxes is to create things offered for sale. The government can't buy anything unless they're offered for sale, and they'll be offered for sale at certain prices. And as long as the government's paying those prices and no more, then the prices aren't going to go up because the economy needs the government's money. Otherwise it's not going to be able to get its house burned down. So it has to sell at the government's prices if the amount the government's spending is, contained, let's say. If the government wants to spend more than that and people start raising their prices because they don't need it anymore, because they already have enough to pay taxes and to save, the government can pay more and buy that. But now it's redefining the value of its currency downward. So if it starts paying $40,000 for soldiers and it gets, a million of them, and it decides it wants more soldiers, but at $40,000, there aren't any more soldiers coming out. So it starts paying $50,000. Now the currency is worth less by that amount. It's now redefined its currency downward. And in fact, for the same tax liability, it's spending more it'll get fewer soldiers because the economy can get the money to pay the tax by sending fewer soldiers to the government. So Pavlina Chernova was an intern for me back in 1997, and I had to write a paper on that. It's her math model called monopoly pricing. And it's a very simple model, but it's well worth it. And it's the foundation for the whole price level and the whole system. And it's beautifully
it's on your site, isn't it? It's on Macroeconomics.
Yeah, under mandatory readings. That was my daughter's name for the category. And it shows you exactly how the price level works. So that doesn't mean all the things you can do to affect the price level are politically expedient. In fact, a lot of them aren't. You would never even attempt to do it, but you could. From a logical point of, just from an operational point of view, sure, you can do that. So if you wanted prices to fall 50%, the government could just cut the prices it offers for everybody 50%. the economy has no choice. If it doesn't offer things at the lower prices, government spending goes from 5 trillion to zero. You've got this massive deflation until you get the money you need from the government to pay the tax and to save. But is that, constructive public policy? No, of course not. But it makes the point of how it works.
People confuse the politics with the economics sometimes, don't they?
Yeah, sure. And they'll say, well, it's wrong. What I just said is wrong because if you did that, you'd lose the election. Well, that's just a faulty logic, right? That's not what I was saying at all. Yeah.
So you can't have genuine inflation unless the government increases the prices that it's prepared to pay for things over time.
Yeah, and in fact, what you get are a series of one-time price increases as the government does that. And so all the major inflations in Latin America were traced to indexation, where if the CPI went up, the government would automatically pay more, which I won't go through all the channels, but they were already at a level where that caused foreign exchange to go down. And part of it was the distributional things that caused it, which would make the CPI go up, which would make them pay more, which would make foreign exchange go down. And so the exchange rate go down. And so they had this, runaway inflation because of indexation, which is the government paying it. But if you look closely, it's a series of one-time increases. It's not a continuous increase.
Maybe we could move on to...
Yes, I was just going to suggest, we
yeah.
have a lot of questions that people have sent in. Stephen, do you want to
start off again? Maybe we could start
let me just say, I have all the time you want, but if you have a limit, that's fine too.
No, it's great. It's great to have you on. We're so grateful that you've given us your time today. There's a question from Richard here, which says, central banks have one tool, raising or lowering interest rates. Either direction, we have winners and losers. Can you suggest another tool that central banks could use that would spread the pain and reward more equitably? Now, I suspect...
spread what pain?
Go on.
What pain are we talking about? Spreading?
Well, of course, as many of us know, central banks often get the interest rate story the wrong way around.
Yes.
Talking about the effect on the economy and the use of interest rates in order to attempt to manage inflationary pressures conflicts with what we were just talking about.
Unfortunately for the central banks, I guess, debt to GDP has gotten so high that the fiscal impact of rate increases, which is it increases the deficit spending, overwhelms any differences in propensity to spend between borrowers and savers. So any what you call monetary effects or credit effects get drowned in the extra funds that the government suddenly starts spending, because when they raise rates, they don't increase taxes to pay for it. It just flat out adds to the deficit spending. When you're over 100% debt to GDP, 1% increase in rates is adding, let's say, 1% to the deficit spending. Now, it's not all at once because it's not all short term. But if you look at the present value calculation, it has that effect and it rolls around pretty quickly. And if you look at the data from countries that do that, it's pretty clear to me every time that that's what's happening, especially in the United States in the last year and a half. As they started raising rates, the deficit spending went up to like 6% of GDP in in an expansion cycle, which is crazy. And half of that, maybe 4% of that, is interest, on the debt. So, and that's still going up. And so the economy keeps getting stronger. So they keep raising rates some more. So it keeps getting stronger. It doesn't end.
It's really important people understand it's complicated, because in Australia we have a much lower government debt to GDP ratio.
That's right. So you might not have the same pass through.
And we have a different mortgage market too. So the impact on households of raising rates is not the same here as the US, which is it's important that policymakers don't seem to understand this, because we basically match what the US is doing with interest rates virtually. The time. And
well, look, when you
very different.
in the private sector, when you raise rates, you're just shifting income between borrowers and lenders, right? So if it's a net zero for the private sector, and there's winners and losers for sure, but it's not going to affect the macroeconomy unless the propensity to spend interest income is lower than for the lenders than it is for the borrowers. And that's what the Federal Reserve, sort of assumes. And that's what the Reserve Bank in Australia assumes. In fact, I think from looking at their forecast that they assume that interest income doesn't get spent at all. There's a zero propensity to spend it. That's the only way they could be forecasting a recession from the rate hikes, because it would show, all this spending taken out of the economy. And then as the economy's shown that now they've adjusted their models and they're no longer showing recession, I would guess their models now show, maybe 50 or 60% propensity to spend interest income, whatever it is. But I think they just started with a wrong assumption on how much interest income gets spent. You can, excuse me a second, get a glass of water.
The story there is that, at least in the US, the general view about the impact of changes in interest rates on total spending and on inflation is the wrong way around. So that when they increase interest rates, it is more likely to accelerate spending than decelerate it, because the big payer of interest in the US is the federal government, because there is such a high government debt to GDP ratio. In Australia, it's more complicated.
Should have had this out there first.
Oh, that's okay, Warren. Anyway, we don't think that central banks are best positioned to manage inflation in the first place, do we?
Yeah. So, look, they don't understand the source of the price level. They don't understand any of that. They have their relative value models, and then they have their historical correlations, and they do the best they can without the understandings.
And it's really the Treasury that's in charge rather than the central bank. I like that you sometimes tell the story about a child in the passenger seat in the car with a toy steering wheel.
Yeah. And it's which is Congress. It's Congress's decisions. And you hear people say, well, MMT thinks we should shift responsibility from the Fed to Congress, but you'll never get Congress to do anything, so that's ridiculous. Well, they miss the point that the Fed's the kid with the steering wheel that doesn't do anything. It's always been Congress. It's just had the illusion that the Fed's doing it, or people have believed it, but they've never done it. So it's not talking about shifting anything. It's already there. It's been there the whole time.
Yeah, interest rates just redistribute income in the private sector.
Now it's worse than that.
Yeah,
because when a government raises interest rates, the only thing that happens operationally is the government pays out more interest on its public debt. It doesn't do anything else. It makes an announcement, there's a press release, does that, but then it pays more interest on reserves, more interest on treasury bills, more interest on new treasury securities. It just starts paying more interest and increasing deficit spending. That's all it does. And those funds go to people who already have money. They don't go to anybody else. You only earn interest on money you already have, in proportion to how much money you have. So the Fed in the US, by raising rates from 0 to 5.5, has decided to award $1.2 trillion, which is larger than the defense budget at an annual rate. It wasn't that for the last year, but the annual rate is there. $1.2 trillion, which is a lot larger than the military spending, to people who have money in proportion to how much they have. Nothing could be a more obscenely regressive policy. And they're doing this to fight inflation and to cause unemployment to go up so that the economy will get some slack and inflation will come down. Now, how could that possibly make any sense to anybody who looks at it from an operational point of view? It's like the most ridiculous thing you could hear. If somebody ever, some congressman brought up the idea, well, look, we got inflation, so what we're going to do is we need to get unemployment up. So let's approve $1.2 trillion to pay to people who already have money in proportion to how much they already have. I mean, it's like, even the most diehard, Reagan trickle-down conservative wouldn't come up with that. It's just too far-fetched for anybody. Yet that's what the Federal Reserve does unilaterally. And it does one more thing. It's kind of like a stock split. If you have a company that has shares of stock and they split it 2 for 1, the stock falls in value 50% because you have twice as many shares for the same equity. They do it so the price is lower so more people can buy it or something, but the value drops. So when the government's paying interest, you've got the public debt, which is a net financial assets in dollars, and it's awarding another 5% to the public through people who already have money, trickle down, whatever. It's kind of like it's like a stock split or a stock dividend. They're reducing the value of that whole thing they have by just handing out 5% more of it. And it's completely, on the demand side. There's no supply side event here at all. And so what I've noticed over 50 years is that the inflation rates of most countries very closely approximate the interest rates, the short term, the Fed funds rate, the interbank rate, whatever they're going to call it, the LIBOR rate. And I could always, just by looking at LIBOR, 99% of the time, be able to understand what the inflation rate was going to be, not in the same day, but over 3 or 6 month period of time. They all gravitated towards short-term LIBOR. And it's just uncanny how that works all the time. And of course, the economists will look at the causation the other way. Well, that's because central bank puts it there because of inflation. Now, I've always looked at it. I understand that, and they do that, and they talk about it. But when they try and change it to make things happen, the inflation rate tends to go towards where, what rate they change. So when Alan Greenspan was Fed chairman, and his forecast showed inflation was low, interest rates were maybe 1%. And his forecast showed that inflation was going to go up. And so he raised rates based on his forecast. And rates did go up. And they all thought he was a genius for having this great forecast. And I remember looking at it and saying, no, he caused that to happen. The higher rates caused the inflation to go to his forecast. Now, I can't prove any of this. Okay, I can only give you the outline, and I'm not trying to say it's a fact.
If you say that to American economists of about our age, they always talk about Paul Volcker.
Yeah. Okay. So my story with Volcker, I have a different narrative, of course, but I was right in the middle of that. I remember being on the desk and see on a Wednesday, which was a settlement day, seeing Fed funds at 28 bid, no offer, and on my screen going, this guy's, because what he did was he gave up control of the interest rate he had in Washington and instead shifted it to the New York Fed, who did the actual monetary operations. He told the instructions for the New York Fed was don't let borrowed reserves go above $50 billion. The banks need more than that. Don't give it to them. Okay. You just starve them for the money to stop inflation. Well, it's not possible because the reserve requirement is based on your calculation of what your deposits were at that time, 2 weeks ago. Then, so you calculate that you need 55 billion as a system 2 weeks ago, and then there's only 50 billion there. Where are you going to get? And the other five's an overdraft, and Washington's telling New York, don't let them borrow on this overdraft, And so they would trade Fed funds to each other. Each bank try and cover his position, which would only establish a short, an overdraft in the next bank. And they just kept bidding these funds up, and I saw them 28 no offer, and they still had 55 billion of reserves, 5 billion of which was an overdraft that was not allowed. And so it was up to the New York Fed to decide when enough is enough and say, okay, we'll give you enough. We'll cover that overdraft with a loan at 14%, a loan at 19%, a loan at 22%, and set the rate that way. So instead of the Washington, and New York Fed was saying to Washington Fed, like, what rate are we supposed to give them the money? Are we supposed to price this overdraft at? So all they're doing is pricing the overdraft by giving them an alternative source of funds. And Washington didn't understand the question. Volcker did not understand the question. And so they just wound up doing this for, 6 months or something. The New York Fed just somehow trying to figure out, second guess Washington, and they set the rates at 20, 22, 20. They had them all over the place. And
did the high interest rates bring inflation down, or was it something else?
Okay, so the way I saw it was the high interest rates were pushing inflation up. Okay, they were causing, because they were operating through the cost channel, the money supply, if you want to call it that, but the lending and the loans create deposits and all that. We had this credit expansion going because of the inflation, and it actually creates a money shortage, because if you have a Apple computer and you have $200 billion in cash and prices double, you need $400 billion to run your company. You're going shopping with $200 in your pocket and the price is double, you need $400. So it causes a money shortage. Inflation does. It's not the other way around. And B, the deficit spending was 6%, which I thought was very high, but the inflation rate was 12. I'm using very round numbers here. Okay. And so the real public debt was dropping, okay, by like 6%, which is the same as running a 6% budget surplus with no inflation, right? And so the net financial assets in real terms in the economy were dropping precipitously. And at a time when people needed more net financial assets, they needed more equity to support their credit structure. The savings desire was going sky high because of the inflation. And your desires are in real terms when you're in a real economy. They're not in nominal terms. They're fundamentally determined in real terms. And so we had this horrible crash in 1979, 1980 from this collapse of the real public debt. So when you look at the public debt going up, you got to look at it after, in real terms to see how it's stressing the population. And it's stressing the population when it's in real terms, okay, not in nominal terms. And so that's what happened. And so the whole collapse, the high rates prolonged the inflation. They caused the public debt to collapse in real terms, which caused a huge fiscal contraction. And it was one of the more severe. But you don't hear that narrative from anybody.
No.
Okay, and it was so severe that OPEC had been raising oil prices. They'd gone from $3 to $40 in 10 years, I think, less than 8 years, 9 years, and which is how many times higher? 13 times higher or something. That's like today going from 70 to 1,000 or something like that. And everything's getting passed through because fertilizer is all petroleum. Costs were going all over, and governments are certainly indexed to that. They're not going to starve their employees. They're going to pay them enough so they can pay the higher price. So we had this government spending, paying the higher prices as OPEC was raising the price. Our military is a huge buyer of oil. We didn't cut consumption because OPEC was raising prices. And so the price of everything went up to match that, which is a smart thing to do. Because either you're going to have your real terms of trade deteriorate where you're sending 10 times more stuff to Saudi Arabia for their oil because your prices stayed low and their oil went high, or your prices go up to match it, and then you're sending your real terms of trade stay the same. So we were in this leapfrog thing, which was sort of sustaining our real terms of trade. So that was, it wasn't like, in real terms, it wasn't a bad thing to be doing. Politically, it was a disaster, but that's a different story. But if you look at it just from the economic point of view, it wasn't a bad thing. And it was a wild era because of that, much more than anything anybody's seen since. And so anyway, it all collapsed because the real public debt fell. So it was just another vicious fiscal contraction that caused it. Now, the other interesting thing that happened was the reason the price of oil collapsed was because demand dropped by it was a global collapse, like 15 million barrels a day. And Saudis, they can't cut production. They cut production by 15 million barrels a day to try and hold the price, but they can't cut production anymore because then you have to cap wells and shut them down. So there was just this excess oil, and the price went down to 10. And it stayed there for a long time until demand picked up enough to where they could start setting price again, which is a whole other story I won't go into now.
Okay, well, we're going to maybe go into another student question, but just to end that discussion, it makes sense then, as you often say, that we may as well have a policy interest rate in the US of 0 and just leave it there.
Yes, well, I think once so in all the, my base case for analysis, like the British, when they went to Africa, there was a hut tax, people came to work, they paid them. Anybody who wanted to work, they'd take them down there, why not? They spent more than they collected, and they didn't pay interest on that extra. Like, why would they? Nobody asked for it. It didn't even come up. And you couldn't think of any reason to do it. And it's the same with any of these, way back then with any of these currencies, Alfred the Great, he did the same thing. Nobody ever pays interest on that. The question never came up. There was never any reason to do it or benefit to do it. We started the UMKC Buckaroo. I don't know if you talked about that, student currency.
Yeah.
They want, So they tax the students 20 buckaroos a semester. You earn them by going to work at the hospital or the police station. You get paid 1 per hour. and they earn enough to pay the tax and some extra to save them because they like to save, and there's no interest. It's a zero rate policy. So in the base case for analysis, you have a tax liability, people show up, you pay anybody who shows up, that's a job guarantee. Why not? And then they earn more than enough to pay the tax. They certainly can't earn less than enough. And you don't pay them any interest on it, and it works just fine. And the value of your currency stays stable. Okay, the UMKC pays $1 per hour of student labor 25 years ago. It pays that today. The value of the buckaroo in terms of dollars, if kids sell them to each other, has gone from $5 to $25. So it's appreciated 500%. But that's only because the dollar's depreciated, right? It means, $5 used to buy an hour of student labor. Now it takes 25, 25 years later. That's got nothing to do with this currency. It's internally stable. It doesn't matter if the school goes out and borrows foreign currency. They can still tax these kids, pay these kids. They have full employment in buckaroos the whole time. They have constant deficits. They have zero rate policy. It's independent of anything else the university does financially. It's its own circuit. It's not, it's entirely stable over 25 years. It's the smallest open economy you could possibly imagine. That used to happen every time I spoke in Australia with Bill Mitchell's conference. Well, what you don't understand is a small open economy.
That feeds on very nicely to Alistair's question, which is that you don't use the term monetary sovereignty, whereas some MMT economists talk a lot about countries needing to build monetary sovereignty over time to reduce their susceptibility to exchange rate depreciations. Why is that? Why don't you like the term?
Well, I asked him to define monetary sovereignty. Can you define it for me? It's sort of a circular definition, right?
I guess it's a currency issuing a government that collects taxes in its own currency, doesn't have a fixed exchange rate, and we usually say has no significant foreign currency debt.
Okay, so if it has, let's say it has a fixed exchange rate and it has foreign currency debt. So now is it not a monetary sovereign?
It's
you could still
potentially financially constrained in a way that it wouldn't be if it didn't.
Well, but not in its own currency. It can still hire the unemployed in a job guarantee or just in regular public service. That doesn't stop it. It's not going to bounce checks in local currency. It can set a zero interest rate. It doesn't stop it. It doesn't interfere with anything at the local currency level. It's a totally separate circuit. And so that's why I don't think this use of the word is constructive in understanding foreign trade, understanding problems of emerging markets and other places. I think it's totally counterproductive.
Warren, you run out of foreign exchange reserves, run out of the ability to borrow foreign currency. You can be
fine, but you can still sustain full employment in your local currency. Yeah. Okay, and you can still, and if you look at the real wealth of a nation, which is everything you produce domestically plus imports minus exports, 70% more is your domestic output. And when you're looking at 30 and 40% unemployment, the losses from unemployment in these countries are much larger than anything that might happen to their real terms of trade. Because no matter what happens to your international finance, the real terms of trade stay the same. And if you've given away some of your trading edge, or it affects your prices that you trade at, you've given away some of your real terms of trade, fine, okay? And what I'll say is you want to optimize your real terms of trade, and here's how you do it. But to mix that in with monetary sovereignty, which is got something to do with the local currency and its ability to function, and to use that to sustain full employment, to produce the real goods and services that you're going to use to trade to get your imports, it's very counterproductive in trying to understand how that works. And that's why, like when we were at that conference, the people who do that, they can't keep straight how the whole thing works because they've got all that stuff, interfering with their ability to get to the bottom of what's actually going on.
I should say that Warren and I were at a conference in Berlin that Dirk Entz and others organized recently. Before that, we were at an MMT summer school in Poland. And this leads on nicely to another question we've had about what advice would you give to the government of a crisis-prone economy like Argentina Because I know
Yeah.
from Poland that Warren has a set of slides on the Mosler economic site anyone can look at, which address that very issue.
Yeah. So
that advice,
I tell the
please.
story. We have like Boy Scouts in the U.S. I don't know if you have such a thing. So I tell the story about these little Boy Scouts come home, and the Scoutmaster says, "What was your good deed for today?" And the little boys go, "Oh, 5 of us helped this old lady cross the street." And he goes, "Well, why did it take 5 of you?" And he says, "Well, she didn't want to go." So what you have is a situation in these countries where, the situation they are now is benefiting the people in charge. The ruling class is benefiting tremendously from what's going on there now. And they don't want to do these things. They don't. What do you mean? Yeah, I could have full employment. I could get rid of inflation. Like, why would I do that? I'm doing really well with the system I have. So first you have to have, the old lady has to want to cross the street. How many psychiatrists does it take to change the light bulb? Well, only one, but the light bulb has to want to change, right? So the assumption that these countries actually want some of these progressive goals we have is completely wrong. Okay, the idea that Turkey wants something other than it has, I think, is completely wrong. I think they're perfectly happy with what they have. And the idea that in the United States we could have full employment, I don't think these people like full employment. And I don't think the majority of Americans like full employment. Okay, because when you're at full employment, if you want to hire a plumber, you got to pay them $75 an hour. When there's a lot of unemployment, you can get a plumber at $20 an hour, and there's people waiting in line, to kiss up to you, to take care of you because there's unemployment. So the 90% that are employed, when you have 10% unemployed, they really like it that way because everybody becomes their slave to their money. And they go in a restaurant and they can demand service and everything else. And now we have a little bit of a labor shortage. We have very low unemployment. They hate it. Oh, you can't get help. These people want more money. They want to they don't like it at all. So number one, we got to be aware that when you ask me, what would you recommend to these countries? It's who am I talking to and what would they like to see happen, right? So given that, I'll let you rephrase the question. Let me give you an example. I was in Argentina a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And I met with the head of the central bank. He was a young guy. And the first thing he said was, "Well, you don't have to introduce yourself because I've been reading your stuff for 10 years. And there were only like 5 of us at the meeting, including the guy who had brought me there. And we talked, they had interest rates at 25%. They just raised them because inflation was 20%. And I had my presentation here, which I just gave him a copy of, pointing out that the higher rate was causing the inflation. And as they raised rates, inflation was just going to go up, and there was just no end to this. And the other one of his analysts said, "Yeah, there's a 1977 or 87 paper by Sergeant Wallace or some mainstream, and they're saying the same thing." And I said, "Yeah, when debt to GDP gets too high, or the interest rate itself gets too high, because even with low debt to GDP, they only had 30 or 40% debt to GDP. But at 20% interest, that's 8% of GDP. That's a big number." Okay, and so as the interest rate gets higher, it increases the deficit in the spending, and even with low debt to GDP, it's just. And he said his answer was they just negotiated an IMF program. He kind of liked the program, and they were required to keep a real interest rate.
Are you happy with leftover risotto for dinner?
Oops, we got somebody else on.
Sorry,
somebody needs to mute.
Thank you.
Somebody needs to mute. Okay, so they had an IMF package, and he didn't want to rock the boat on that. So he said, "You're right. I know it. We're going to keep doing what we're doing." So after I left, inflation goes to 30, so they went to 35. Inflation goes to 50, they go to 55. It's the same thing, right? It's flooding the market with pesos on interest expense, and there's other channels as well. And last week, it got to like 250% to try and fight inflation. It's like there's no end to this. And does he know about it? Yeah. Are they doing anything? No.
So I think probably the best thing to say then is if we were to imagine that people in positions of power in Argentina seriously wanted price stability and full employment, what might they do to bring that about?
So one thing is, look, in all these countries, behind the scenes, either explicit or not, I think the exporters are in control. They control the narrative. They have large numbers of employees, and exports reduce your real wealth, but they increase the wealth of the exporters at the expense of everybody else. And so you've got this export-led growth narrative that's supported by mainstream economics everywhere. That was the whole mercantilism thing, was exporters, right? Fixed exchange rates, build your reserves. That was supporting exporters.
Oh, you're on mute. Somehow Warren's got muted.
I'm sorry. I think that was me.
How's that?
Yeah,
that's better.
Okay, so the exporters in Argentina sell everything somewhere else. They don't sell anything in Argentina, so they don't want domestic demand. They like a lot of inflation continuous because it keeps their costs down, and that's all they care about are their costs, so they can sell somewhere else. And they're supported by this whole narrative, even if they're not specifically making the noise themselves. They've got everybody around them supporting it. They're hiring people. They have all these jobs. They got all this and they know you have to be competitive. That's how you earn foreign exchange. That's how you pay the IMF. The IMF programs are all there to support exporters, so the IMF loans can get paid back, right? And so there's this whole cabal operating that supports exporters, and there's a superior morality assigned to exporting rather than domestic consumption. It's like a Puritan ethic or something, to do this. And so you've got to get past that narrative before there's going to be and replace it with something else, a progressive narrative, let's say. But until then, these people are so deeply embedded that they don't even know it themselves. And I remember President Obama, who was supposed to be a progressive, he got up and said, look, the U.S. has a problem. They were talking about the trade deficit. He was like, all wrapped up about it and wound up about it. He said, look, we have to consume less and export more, okay, as a nation. And so he gets this Council of Economic Advisors, and the head of it is Jeff Immelt from General Electric, who is our #1 exporter. And so this is like a deeply ingrained thing, which is obviously the correct way to go, I guess. It's not questioned. Goes without saying you support export-led growth. And even Jan, when you were asking about Germany, it was the same thing. All these narratives in her head that were pushing back were all these export-led growth narratives. The whole defense of China and how well China is doing is all this export-led growth thing. And at the end of the day, export-led growth is exploiting labor to have low-cost goods that they can sell somewhere else rather than have the goods wind up with the people who produced them, and supporting the exporters. Okay, so I'll let you rephrase the question one more time.
Well, let's move on to another question from Susan and another part of the world.
Oh, how would I get to full employment? It's pretty much the same everywhere. It's very quick. So just what I told them. You go to a zero rate policy. You stop paying all this interest out to people who already have money in proportion to have. Your foreign exchange rate either stops going down or goes down less. They had other channels about that. You have a job guarantee and you fully provision the public sector at the same time. So you get everybody you want in the public sector for quality public services. And then anybody left in the job guarantee, you have loose enough fiscal policy to transition them back to the private sector. And so you at full employment, you've optimized your real wealth produced domestically. And you've also helped your real terms of trade, which is a little more complicated, but it does help them. And that was fine. And he liked the answer and he agreed, but it wasn't anything they were going to get anywhere near at that point in time. There's no political will to do that. And it's the same thing for Turkey. And same thing for Venezuela, same thing anywhere. It works anywhere, but they're not going to do it. It's just not in the interest of the leadership.
You're reminding me of that famous paper from Kaleski in the 1940s about the political economy of full employment. There a bit, Warren, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Moving on to Susan's question. Was the European Monetary Union dead on arrival, or are there structural or operational innovations short of becoming one country that might increase the fiscal space and flexibility of its middle-income members? That was Susan's question.
Yeah. So first of all, they did what they did because that was the only way they would have a European Union and a single currency. So some of the ridiculous things that are in there, like the 3% limit, the nations wouldn't have joined without it because they had their own ideas of things, and that was part of their ideology, right? And the idea that there was really no bailouts, that the deposit insurance for the banking system was at the national levels because Germany didn't want to bail out Italian banks and so on. That they had to have that in there or nobody was going to sign this thing to begin with. So they did what it takes to get it signed, and I think to prevent World War III, because Europe up till then had a bad history of fighting with each other. And they just had the thing in, where was it, Kosovo, remember? And that might have even been a little after. So they have a brutal history. You go to one of these countries and name a country, they've been in constant warfare for like thousands of years. And so it worked. We haven't seen that kind of warfare in Europe. I know Ukraine's Europe, but not within the European Union. But it was an unworkable document. It could not function economically. It was going to hit some brick walls. And when it hit those walls, I said at the time that they would make the correct choices because there'd be no other choice. And after hitting, one or two or three brick walls, they would have, a successful currency union, and which I think has happened. I mean, you can argue it. So the first problem they had was the banking system. A banking system can't work without credible deposit insurance. You're just a liquidity crisis waiting to happen, which we saw in the US. And then we shored up our deposit insurance. There hasn't been a problem since. It had nothing to do with interest rates or the economy. It's just, deposit insurance. So in 2012, it was all ready to fall apart. And Mario Draghi got up there and said, we will do what it takes to prevent default, which guaranteed all the national debts. It meant the central bank, they all had a central bank guarantee. All the spreads went away. They all converged down to the policy rate over this period of time. And the deposit insurance was credible because once Italy or Spain could write a check to their banks and knowing that their bonds were guaranteed by the central bank, the checks weren't going to bounce and they were fine. So they got through that hurdle. The next hurdle was that it was impossible to operate with a 3% deficit limit because they had no ability to conduct counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It was okay on the way up, but it doesn't work on the way down. It's kind of like when you drive into a car rental return, they got those things on it with spikes on them. You can drive over them forward, but you can't back up, right? So these economies were okay on the way up. You had private sector credit expansion, you had exports, you had all kinds of things. And it wasn't great, but it was okay. But then when things went south, it didn't work. So when you look at COVID, what happened was they abandoned, they changed the deficit limit, the 3% limit, into a policy tool. Okay, so it no longer became a limit, it became a policy tool. And Italy ran 11% deficit, fine, no problem, because it was appropriate for the economic conditions. That's what a policy tool is. And now they're discussing whether it should go back to 3% or whether they should allow it to be higher. They're not sitting there going, look, we have a 3% by law, no discussion. They're recognizing it as a policy tool. And I think they'll come through with that and use it as a policy tool. And now they'll have a counter-cyclical policy tool. And so once they do that, they're kind of home clear. So with that do what it takes guarantee by Draghi, which didn't have to happen. He could have let the whole union disintegrate, but he didn't. And with the use of a policy tool with COVID, turning that limit into a policy tool, I think they've got all the tools they need to now have a very prosperous European Union. And their unemployment numbers are still high, but they're like at kind of all-time lows at 6%. So they are doing it, and they're going to be cautious. They're not going to just increase deficits to try and get unemployment down to zero or anything like that, but they're going to understand what the tool does. And then now they have 3 or 4 years of hard data where their analysts can tell them exactly what happens when you raise or lower the limit. And they don't have to be afraid of the sky is falling or something like that, because they've got the data. And so they've got everything they need now, all the tools they need to succeed, I think. And the other thing that happened, I used to be involved with all these movements to leave the lira, start your own currency, or leave the euro, go back to lira, leave the euro, go back to drachma. And people don't want to do that. And I would show people how to do that if you want. If you got people who want to do it, here's how you do it. There won't be any inflation, but it's not going to work. People aren't going to do it. Even in Greece, when they had their crisis, which was horrendous, they took a polls, and 70% of the people, they were asked, do you want the Germans to run the money, or do you want your own, Greek government to run your money? 70% said they want the Germans to run the money. They just don't trust their own governments running the money. They've been through such bad times in the past with, 20% plus inflation and currency going down 50% or more, that they don't, they can't see the euro itself as the problem. It is the problem, but they don't see it that way, because through this whole thing, the euro's been stable. If they took a trip somewhere, they could buy things, and interest rates were low the whole time. By their standards, very low, zero and everything else. And inflation was very low. They've never had this period of time with this kind of low inflation. So it can't be the unemployment problem can't be the currency. Well, of course it was the 3% deficit limit, which was tied in with the currency. And so there was never, I didn't think there was ever any real chance that there'd be any kind of popular support for leaving the euro. I could sympathize with it because they were in this straitjacket of 3%, but they came out of it, okay, without people leaving the euro or threatening. They came out of it because of COVID. And so now it's home free. So go ahead.
So would you say there are signs around the world, in the US and the Eurozone to an extent, of policymakers catching on to some of the insights from MMT?
Yeah.
Be optimistic?
I like to make the point that, MMT is one, and just kind of declare victory and move on. Because if you look at Obama, when he wanted to do a stimulus, first of all, his advisors cut it in half because they were too scared to even show the $2 trillion to Congress. So they showed $900 billion over 2 years and then he and Secretary Clinton flew to China, who they thought were our bankers, to make sure they would buy the debt before they started proposing running a deficit. Okay. And then Paul Ryan, the number one Republican, was talking about, we're going to become the next Greece, and we're going to be on our knees at the IMF begging for money. We can't have this program. And you heard Paul Krugman had this big document saying interest rates were going to go up, and all this nonsense that was there in spades, and we had a much weaker recovery than we should have had, and it was not good. And then 8 or 9 years later, with President Biden, it's like they passed $5 trillion in COVID spending, not a word about that other stuff. All they talked about was how much inflation it might or might not cause. And maybe the Republicans were against that much because it would cause inflation, and Democrats wanted whatever. They compromised at some number. But the change in the argument was clear, that it went from solvency to inflation, which is exactly what we've been trying to get across for 30 years. And so I take the win, right?
Yeah, I wish we were a bit quicker to take the win in Australia. Our policymakers a bit slower.
Yeah, sure.
Unfortunately, but we'll catch on eventually, I guess. We probably ought to be moving towards ending now. Is there anything that you would recommend our students or other people on the line read or look at to deepen their understanding of some of the things we've been talking about?
I think what we talk about, clean sheet of paper, is easy to understand.
Yeah.
Especially my book is very easy, right? It's non-technical and it's all there. But the hard part is reconciling it with what you hear and what policymakers are saying, and then trying to get through to them and in a way that they can understand it. And I think that's the challenge. And I think there's been a lot of inroads, and it's made a lot of sense. Because if you Google any one of those policymakers, like MMT and then the name, you'll see a statement that they've made. if you do Jerome Powell MMT, it'll come up. Powell says it's nonsense. Mario Draghi MMT, Mario Draghi says we should take a closer look or something. So that it's gotten to the point where they've all commented on it, which means it's there. And so learn the fundamentals, which isn't that hard. And it's all in the white paper. And the white paper has links to all the things that are written. Be careful of what the other MMT proponents write, because a lot of them get pieces of it wrong. And I'm just going to, I'm talking from my point of view.
Yeah.
And then when you start arguing with policymakers from what I would call out of paradigm things, you can lose the arguments because you're wrong. So when you, and so I would be careful of those things. Whenever anything's out there that isn't reconciled with what I'm saying, get to the bottom of it. And if you think I'm wrong and they're right, fine, but get to the bottom of it, because you don't want to walk around with, in a paradigm that has, you want it to be bulletproof. I'll tell you, I've had this stuff out there for 30 years now, and I don't think there's been a word that's been, shown as not correct, right? I mean, I had typos, but apart from that.
I'd say virtually every time that I think I disagree with Warren, then a few months later, I've changed my mind.
Yeah, and sometimes it was because you hadn't quite had what I was saying in context, which is okay. But the fact that you go back and reconcile it, whether it takes a month or 2 months, and talk to other people and you'll find out at the end of the day that, what I have is logically sound. It's bulletproof. I don't lose any arguments with policymakers when I talk to them or on discussions. And because it's just too simple. I mean, this was common knowledge 250 years ago. Everybody in Africa knew how the silly crown worked. Everybody in Pompeii knew how their coins worked, that the government would tax you so that you have to earn these coins. You'd show up, they'd pay you to be a police officer in these coins, and then you'd pay them.
Some of your ideas people had half developed before, hadn't they? Alfred Mitchell Innes, 100 years.
Yeah. He was a lawyer.
Yeah.
He just wrote up how the currency worked back then, and he had, I'd say, it all there, sure. And there are pieces of it in different places, but that doesn't mean it came from that. And the other thing is, people will argue historically, and I'll say it doesn't matter. And Randy says to me, "Oh no, it does matter. It's got to be historically consistent." It's like why? Well, otherwise people aren't going to take you seriously. It's like, well, okay, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be right. If you put me in a room full of people and I have to set up a monetary system, I know how to do it. Whether that's the way the British did it or that somebody did it, 4,000 years ago, I don't really care. I can set it up right then and there. It's going to work and it's going to function, be a full functioning monetary system, just like the dollar, the pound, or anything else. And that's what I'm focused on, how today's currencies work, rather than arguing about how we got to where we are. I like that part. I'll, look at it and read about it, but it's not what the important thing is, to have a progressive agenda, right? And what I have is a base case for analogy, and that gets, they say, oh, well, MMT means you have to have a JG or something. No, I have a base case for analysis where you put on a tax and you hire anybody who shows up for work, you pay them, and they pay the tax and save some. Now, if you want to give me a reason to not hire everybody who shows up, or not pay them enough so that they can pay the tax, the total payment, so I have to go burn their houses down, we can discuss it. And I've had these discussions, and by the end of the discussion, it's like, well, okay, we are better off having my reason for not having a JG. The burden of proof is on somebody who thinks you should not have the JG. The burden of proof is not on me to say why you should have it. The burden of proof is on you to say why we should not have it. Well, instead of having these people there, we're better off if they're going to be unemployed. Like, why? The private sector won't hire them once they get unemployed. They're going to be unemployed a lot longer. Don't we want them back working in the private sector? Doesn't the private sector only hire people working, or prefer to hire working people? So let's keep the buffer stock fresh and clean and ready to go to work. And they'll go, well, okay, yeah. When you put it that way, it makes sense. So I haven't had anybody the buckaroo at the UMKC, the Dennis & Dollar, which is Fidel's, and they've been working for decades, and nobody's had any reason to change from that. And they all have full employment, absolute price stability, and zero rate policies. And they haven't had any reason to try a higher rate. It's like when they look at it and they think it through, they go like, why would we do that? Or why would we cause some of our people to be unemployed? We wanted to do public service for the school. Like, well, there's just no, why would we try and balance a budget? You can't come up with any reason to do that once you're operating this model. And so I'm all open, I'm all ears to anybody who wants to deviate from the base case, but we start with the base case, a simple model to show how it works. And then if you want to deviate from it, fine, but the burden of proof is on you to deviate from it, because the way it is works really well. It fully fits and supports a progressive agenda, which I'm synonymous with the green agenda, by the way. It supports everything like that we want to do, efficient deployment of resources, everything else as a base case. And I haven't had an environmentalist come in and say, well, we want to deviate from the base case for anything. That doesn't help anything. Yeah, it's all supportive. So we've got the pillars there, and if they need to be changed, fine, but you got to show me that.
You can talk to policymakers, politicians. I've had conversations with politicians where they've understood all this, but they won't talk about it still.
Yeah.
At the moment,
yeah. Dick Blumenthal, Senator.
That sort of thing. We've in Australia, we have a very popular show on the ABC called Q and A. If you're wondering why MMT hasn't been more on Q and A, they invited Bill Mitchell on once. The Labour Party objected and they withdrew the invitation. I've done a talk in Canberra at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I tried to get them to have Stephanie to give a talk. They're scared of the ideas. Some people, we have senior people in Australia who are perfectly happy with things as they are at the moment. Yeah. And some of them understand.
Yeah, to my point before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we have to force them to
But look, it's gone from me to guys in my office, to a few academics, to millions of people, all grassroots. Mm-hmm. Not a single celebrity, not a single mainstream economist of any note. Some students and things have come over, but so it's been a grassroots movement that's gone from zero to like millions, where every policymaker knows about it and tries to avoid it, right? So that's pretty amazing. Most grassroots things are things like, save the whales, or, environmental degradation and things like that. How many grassroots movements are there over like monetary operations? So it's completely improbable that we're at the point where all of you are here, like intently on this, understanding that this is the biggest thing you can do to bring about, constructive change in life, no matter what you're trying to pursue, whether it's, on the environmental side, or which you have to do, or you're going to have nothing, of course, but, or anything else on the social equity side. This is all like fundamental. And so people are on it, and it's technical, it's monetary operations, it's debits and credits at the central bank. And it's a huge grassroots movement. I just think it's like been an astounding thing to watch for me for 30 years to see this happen with no top-down support. It's all been bottom-up. It's all been people like yourselves. A lot of you probably aren't even trained in economics or anything, but want to get involved and do this. And once you get into it a little bit, you can very quickly see how all these people who are authorities or whatnot are wrong. I mean, really wrong, dead wrong. Okay, and that just is a good feeling from, not that they're dead wrong, but that you know something that they don't, and you're right and they're wrong. It doesn't happen in too many fields. You don't get too many nuclear physicists up there talking. You go, man, that guy's wrong, and I know how that quantum mechanics works. Okay, but these senior economics people, we've got it where regular people, from any profession can look at them and say, you're completely out to lunch, And so that's motivating. And it's motivating because of all the constructive change you can bring if we can just get them to come around or go away, one or the other, right? And so my hat's off to all of you for being here and doing this.
Well, that's a fantastic place to end, Warren. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us. And
you can give everybody my Twitter and my email.
Absolutely.
And just ask me questions anytime. You know,
I think you might get quite a few questions, Warren, because
good.
Some of the ones people sent in before, but we didn't get to the ones that are on the screen. Some of which I'll be able to answer as well. But yes, you should follow Warren on Twitter.
Well, if you ask him on the Twitter account, then other people can all see it.
That's right.
It's kind of like a bulletin board.
Absolutely.
And I answer a lot of questions on Twitter, not because the guy asking him I particularly want to answer them, but I know you're getting those kinds of questions, so I want to give you sound bites. And so if I can do it in Twitter in a few characters, that's something you can do with your next door neighbor or your bank president or whoever you're talking to next.
Can we ask you back again in another trimester, Warren?
Oh yeah,
that would be absolutely great. Good. Thanks again, and I'd like to say this at the end rather than at the beginning, but Warren's insights transformed my life, my career, my view of the economy. They are the reason why we are running the courses that we're running, and if we ever make any real progress, then Mr. Mosler is going to go down the history of economic thought as a very important figure. So let's give him a round of applause, and thank you very much, Warren, for being with us again.
Thank you very much.